Number 3, there's some things that are sometimes called the land grant narratives. Scattered throughout the lists of territories and cities are 5 stories in which the characters come to Joshua and the leaders to ask for and receive their own inheritance. Each case has its own unique features, but there are similar patterns running throughout all of them. These have been identified and labeled as the land grant narratives, and we can see 4 major elements in the pattern. First, there is usually a confrontation that establishes the setting and the characters, a meeting of some type with the leaders. Secondly, the would-be grantees present their case and make a request for the land. Third, the land is granted. Fourth, and finally, a summary of the episode's resolution is given. And the 5 stories are as follows. Caleb, in chapter 14, verses 6 to 15. Caleb's daughter, Aksa, chapter 15, verses 18 and 19. The daughters of Zelophehad in chapter 17, verses 3 to 6, which fulfills a promise made by Moses back in Numbers chapter 27. Fourth, the descendants of Joseph in chapter 17, verses 14 to 18. And fifth, the Levites in chapter 21, verses 1 to 3. Finally, there's some miscellaneous patterns throughout the lists that are important. And they're to be found typically in the introductory and concluding statements that bracket the details of each list. And there are a number of regularities that we'll not discuss at this point. They're not that important. But one does stand out because of its theological significance. And that is the repeated statement, clan by clan. That statement occurs almost 24 times. The careful attention to this detail is undoubtedly to show that an important provision of the law of Moses was being kept. In Leviticus 25, the law of the year of Jubilee and the redemption of the land is given, and it's clear that land was to remain in the clans, and that each clan and the clan members were obligated to redeem the land for their constituent families, especially in verses 23 to 28 in that chapter. So the idea of individual land ownership by the clans is reaffirmed here in the book of Joshua. Let's put it all together and ask the question, what is the importance of them, and oftentimes the mind-numbing detail of these lists? Why is it significant that there are certain patterns to them? Why are there so many chapters in the book of Joshua that are devoted to this? I think there's several answers to those questions. First and foremost, as we've already said, these lists are the heart of the book, chapters 13 to 21, in that they prove, quote unquote, to the Israelites and to the book's readers that God was indeed being true to his promises centuries earlier. On one level, we could say that it's not enough simply to assert that God gave Israel the land, to state that he fulfilled his promises, and to ask the reader to take the author's word for it. That could be done in 3 or 4 verses. But for such promises as these, given so many centuries earlier, such simple assertions would have been profoundly anticlimactic. A deep sense of satisfaction would come if the reader could actually trace the fulfillment of these promises, city by city, hill by hill, wadi by wadi, border by border. It's like reading a good book that a person becomes engrossed in which he or she is reluctant to have it come to an end. The reader wants every word in detail to count, and they slow down toward the end. So too here. The most important commercial transaction that most ordinary American citizens make is the purchase of a house. And there can be several ways of identifying that house's location. For some, it may simply be called the Gillingham place. For others, it is the great big white frame house on the corner with 3 stories and a big porch. For others, it's the place with the bird feeders in the yard. For others, it's the place where all those nice children are. For others, it's known by its postal address, 3 West Maple Street. This happens to be the house where my father grew up in Moorestown, New Jersey. However, in the eyes of the law, the description of the house and the property on which it stands is much more complicated and precise. It will contain certain terminology, and for this, let me just say I pulled out my own real estate deed and changed some of the wording, but the structure of this, what it follows here, is pretty much what you find when you buy a house. So terminology like lots 56 in block 212, in Uptown Unit number 23, being a subdivision of the southeast quarter of the southwest quarter of section 18, Township 34, north, range 8, east of the 6th principal meridian, according to the plat thereof, recorded on such and such a date as document 9765 in book 42 of plats, page 29 in Lincoln County. That language is virtually unintelligible to most normal adults, but when the time comes to buy a home, it's of crucial importance, and the buyers are glad that someone, their lawyer, their survey company at least, understands it, and has looked carefully over it very well. Accurate, precise language such as this is critical to the successful completion of a sale. So too here with the list in Joshua of the lands that Israel inherited. Israel's God not only had promised the land to them, but he had carefully prepared it and parceled it out. He gave precise descriptions, sometimes by describing borders that ran up this hill, turned back at that town, went down into that ravine, ran along that brook, and sometimes by naming the cities that belonged to the tribes in question. The regularities in the list patterns that we've noted are important, just as the regularity in modern real estate surveys is important. Unintelligible as the language of the imaginary real estate survey that we've just read is to the normal person, to those familiar with it and responsible for overseeing real estate transactions, the very regularity of that language makes it intelligible and precise. So too for the Joshua lists. The very fact that each tribe's inheritance is described in language that's almost identical to the others in its general contours guaranteed that each tribe would be able to take its inheritance confidently, knowing that it was of a piece with that of the fellow tribes. And yet, the differences are important as well. We can assume that a sprawling country estate of hundreds of acres spanning 2 counties will have a far more complicated survey description than a simple bungalow on San Martin Boulevard, for example. Certainly the numbers and the names in each survey will be different, and so too here in the Joshua lists. Each one follows general patterns, but each one is unique as well. Oftentimes it's the irregularities that are most significant. As we've already mentioned, the differences in the descriptions for Judah, the Joseph tribe, Simeon, Dan, Levi, are all important theologically. The stories of the claims of individuals show God's fulfillment of the promises down even to individual people's claims. Tribes, clans, families, and even individuals mattered in God's scheme of things. And his provision for the Levites, his priests and special servants, demonstrate other important things about his character and about the religious priorities to be followed in Israelite society. So, despite their seeming impenetrability, the lists in Joshua will richly repay any time invested in understanding them. They are indeed the core of the book of Joshua. They are what we might call the legal data, supporting the tribe's claims to their territories and validating their God's faithfulness to them. They give a deep sense of rootedness to the people. This principle of land ownership, or for some cultures, the idea of rootedness in the land without specific ownership of specific territories. But this principle of land ownership is one of the most fundamental principles of human societies. And in this most geographically rooted of all biblical books, these truths shine forth very clearly.